The question no one dared to ask. The room was quiet, almost too quiet. The soft hum of studio lights and the faint rustle of paper were the only sounds. Cameras stood ready, blinking red, waiting for the moment. Behind them, a live audience sat, in silence, phones tucked away, breaths held, as if they all knew something deeper was about to happen. Keanu Reeves sat calmly on the cushioned chair across from the host, a soft smile on his face. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held something else, something most couldn't see. Pain, experience, stories untold. The interview had started like any other. A few light questions, a joke or two, laughter from the crowd. But the reporter, a young woman named Clara, wasn't like other interviewers. She didn't just want a viral moment, she wanted truth, and something in Keanu's presence made her believe the truth was within reach. She leaned forward slightly, microphone in hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keanu," she said gently, "you've inspired millions with your humility, your kindness. But if you don't mind me asking, what's your biggest regret?" The air in the room shifted. The audience stirred, unsure if they were supposed to hear that. Producers backstage looked at each other, wondering if the question had gone too far, but Keanu didn't flinch. He looked at Clara. He blinked, and then he looked down. A silence followed that seemed to last forever. Then Keanu let out a quiet breath. "My biggest regret," he said softly, "was the day I left, without saying goodbye." Clara looked confused, but she didn't interrupt. The audience leaned in. Even the cameraman holding the long lens had stopped adjusting focus. This wasn't about film anymore. This was something else. Keanu paused as if the words were pieces of a puzzle scattered across his memory. "Years ago," he continued, "before the fame, before all this, there was someone who mattered to me more than anything. She believed in me when no one else did. She taught me how to read when I was struggling in school. She brought me food when I had nothing. She told me I was worth something, even when I didn't believe it myself." He looked up, his eyes shining, not with tears, but with the weight of memory. "Her name was Miriam," he said, "and she was my neighbor's grandmother." There was a soft gasp from someone in the crowd. Others looked around. This wasn't the story they expected. "I was 17, Keanu said, and angry. I hated the world. My father had disappeared. My mom worked night shifts. I barely went to school. I was tired of being broke, tired of people looking at me like I was trash. But Miriam, she never looked at me that way." Clara's eyes were wide. She nodded, encouraging him to go on. "She lived alone," he said. "Had this tiny garden full of flowers. Every morning she'd water them, and she'd wave to me. I didn't wave back at first. Thought it was weird, but she kept waving. Every day. Until one day I waved too." His voice cracked a little. "We started talking. Just 5 minutes a day. She'd ask about school. I'd lie. She knew it, but she never called me out. Then one day, she brought me this old book, The Count of Monte Cristo. Said it was her favorite. I told her I didn't read books. She smiled and said, 'Then this is a good time to start.'" There was a long pause. No one spoke. Even Clara had forgotten she was holding a microphone. "I read it," Keanu whispered. "Every page. And something in me changed. I started thinking maybe there was more to life than just surviving." He took a deep breath. "One day, I told her I was leaving. I got accepted into this small theater program in another city. She smiled and said, 'You're going to shine. Just promise me one thing.' He looked down again. 'Don't forget who you are.' He clenched his hands gently on his lap. I promised her, but I didn't keep it. In the rush of everything, the bus, the new city, the roles, the auditions I never called, never wrote. I kept saying, 'I'll visit next month.' But the months became years." Clara's lips parted, her eyes full of emotion. "One day," Keanu said, "I came back. I finally had some money. I was doing okay. I had planned to surprise her, had flowers in one hand and a signed copy of my first film in the other. His voice dropped. But the house was empty. A for sale sign stood in the yard. I knocked on the neighbor's door, the same one she used to live next to, and they told me. His jaw tightened. She'd passed away 6 months earlier, in her sleep. The room was silent. They said, he continued, her last wish was for someone to give me this. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He opened it slowly. It was a note, written in her shaky handwriting. It said, "You kept your promise. I see you shining. And I never doubted you, not for 1 second. Love always, Miriam." A tear slipped down Clara's cheek. Keanu noticed, but he didn't stop. "That letter sits in my drawer," he said. "I look at it sometimes when I feel lost." He finally looked back at Clara, his voice gentle now. "So, my biggest regret was not going back sooner, not saying goodbye to the one person who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Clara didn't speak. She couldn't. The audience was still. Many had tears in their eyes. A story that had started as a normal interview had turned into something far more powerful. Keanu leaned back slightly, wiped a small tear from his eye, and said with a half smile, "And that's the story no one ever asks me about." The crowd erupted in quiet applause, almost like a moment of respect rather than celebration. Clara finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you for sharing that." But something inside her had shifted, and she wasn't the only one. What no one knew was that this story would become more than just a moment on a screen. It would spark something unexpected, something that would change the course of the entire interview series. But that was only the beginning. The letter that never left his pocket after the interview ended. There was a strange stillness in the studio. Not the usual energy people feel when cameras stop rolling. This was different, emotional, heavy, but beautiful. People didn't rush to pack up equipment. They stood there for a moment quietly talking to each other. A few crew members wiped their eyes. Some audience members just sat in their chairs staring at the spot where Keanu had spoken. Clara turned off her microphone and stood up slowly. She walked over to Keanu, still stunned by what had just happened. He smiled at her, the same warm smile that had made millions love him. But now she saw the layers behind it. It wasn't just charm. It was experience, pain, love, loss. "Thank you," Clara said again, her voice low. Keanu nodded. "Thank you for asking." As he turned to leave, she noticed something. He reached into his coat pocket, touched the folded letter gently, then placed it back like it was something sacred. Outside, it had started to rain. Soft drops, not a storm. Keanu walked to his car slowly, hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly downward. He wasn't thinking about movies or fame or the internet buzz that would explode within hours. He was thinking about Miriam, her laugh, her tiny garden, the way she handed him that book with such belief in her eyes. He sat in his car, watching the rain fall on the windshield. The world outside was moving, but inside everything was still. His phone buzzed. He looked down. It was a text from his assistant. The clip just went live. It's already trending. He didn't care. Instead, he opened his glove compartment. Inside was a small, cloth-bound journal. He flipped it open to the first page. Inside, in the same shaky handwriting, were Miriam's words. "Don't forget who you are." He had read them 100 times. But tonight, they felt new again. Back at the studio, Clara sat alone in the editing room. She had rewatched the interview twice already. There was something about that moment, when Keanu said, "I left without saying goodbye," that haunted her, not because of what he said, but because it mirrored something in her own life. She reached into her bag and pulled out an old photo. It was of her and her older brother Marcus sitting by a lake. They looked young, free, untouched by the world. Marcus had been her best friend growing up. He protected her when kids made fun of her voice. He stayed up with her when their parents fought. He told her she could do anything, but then he left, not in anger, just life pulled them apart. And when he called her asking to meet up during a difficult time in his life, she didn't go. She had a work deadline. She told herself she'd visit later. That visit never happened. He died in a car accident the following week. And Clara had never forgiven herself. Watching Keanu speak, something had opened inside her. She realized she wasn't alone in her regret. And for the first time in years, she felt like maybe healing was possible. The next morning, Keanu walked into a small cafe near his home. It was early. Barely anyone was there. Just the smell of coffee and the quiet clinking of dishes. He liked places like this. Simple, ordinary, honest. He ordered his usual black coffee, no sugar, and sat near the window. A young woman approached timidly, holding a notebook. She looked like she had been waiting for courage all morning. "Excuse me," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you said in that interview. It meant more than you know." Keanu looked up. Her eyes were full of emotion. "What's your name?" he asked. "Hannah." He smiled. "Thank you, Hannah. That means a lot." She hesitated, then sat down across from him. "I had someone too," she said. "My dad. I didn't get to say goodbye. And when I heard your story, I just cried." Keanu nodded slowly. "I think," he said, "there are more people carrying unsaid goodbyes than we realize." Hannah reached into her notebook and tore out a page. She slid it across the table. "This is a letter I wrote him. I never got to send it, but maybe. I just needed to know someone else understands." Keanu took the letter gently, nodded, and folded it. "I'll keep it," he said, and he did. Later that day, back in his home, he placed Hannah's letter next to Miriam's. He didn't read it, not because he didn't care, but because he knew it wasn't about the words. It was about the weight. And he would carry it with honor. That week, the internet was buzzing. Clips from the interview went viral. Millions of views. Endless comments. Headlines that read, "Keanu Reeves shares heartbreaking story about a woman who changed his life." Actor's biggest regret isn't what you think. Watch the moment that silenced the room. This interview made me call my mom immediately. Celebrities started sharing their own regrets. Hashtags like, "say goodbye" and "thank you now" began trending. But for Keanu, it wasn't about going viral. He received hundreds of letters, thousands of messages, people opening up. Strangers telling him things they hadn't told their closest friends, and he read them. Not all at once. Sometimes just one a day. But he read them. He started collecting them in a box he labeled Voices of Goodbye. Then, one morning while sipping coffee on his porch, he had an idea that would turn his regret into something beautiful, something the world wasn't expecting. But before that, one last thing had to happen. He had to go back, to the neighborhood where he met Miriam, to the house with the tiny garden, to the place where his story began. It was a quiet street, older now, trees a little taller, houses freshly painted, but still familiar. Keanu parked his car and walked slowly, each step echoing memories. He stopped in front of the old house. The garden was gone, replaced by gravel and a modern mailbox. He stood there for a long time. A woman peeked out from behind the curtain, then stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" she asked kindly. Keanu turned to her. "I used to know someone who lived here, Miriam." The woman smiled softly. "I never met her, but neighbors talk about her like she was a saint." Keanu chuckled. "Yeah, that sounds like her." The woman hesitated, then stepped back inside. She returned holding a small box. "The last owners left this behind. Said it belonged to the woman who lived here. I've kept it just in case." Keanu took the box with trembling hands. Inside was a small, rusted watering can and a faded photo of a young boy sitting next to an old woman, both smiling in front of a flower bed. It was him. It was Miriam. He held the photo close, heart aching but full. He whispered, "Thank you." And just like that, the regret that had weighed on him for years began to turn into something else. Not joy, not peace, but purpose. And so began the next chapter of the story, a chapter where Keanu Reeves would do something unexpected, not for attention, not for press, but for every person who ever wished they'd said goodbye, and for one woman with a tiny garden who changed his life forever. The garden of regrets. Keanu couldn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, staring at the stars. The old photo of him and Miriam rested on the table beside him. He had looked at it 100 times, memorizing the smile on her face, the way her hand rested gently on his shoulder, the flowers blooming behind them like a promise. He thought about everything that had happened since the interview, the letters, the strangers who poured their hearts out, the young woman Hannah who gave him a letter to a father she never got to say goodbye to, the hashtags, the voices rising from around the world, people saying things they had buried for years, but it wasn't enough. Not yet, he whispered into the quiet room. "Miriam, what should I do with all this?" And just like that, the answer came. Not as a voice, not as a vision, but as a feeling, deep in his chest. Plant the garden again. The next morning, Keanu called his team. He didn't want cameras, no press, just hands, people who wanted to help. They returned to the neighborhood. The woman who now lived in Miriam's house was surprised, but deeply moved when Keanu told her what he planned. "I'd like to rebuild her garden," he said, "not just here, but everywhere." She looked at him confused. "Everywhere?" Keanu smiled. "A garden in every city, a place where people can come to say goodbye." He started with the first one right there, in front of Miriam's old home. They tore up the gravel. Keanu dug with his own hands, not because he had to, because he needed to. Hannah showed up with a few friends. Clara came too, holding a small plant she had grown on her apartment balcony. They worked for days. Neighbors joined. An old man who used to walk by Miriam's house every morning showed up with a pot of lavender. A little girl donated a tiny sunflower she had grown at school. When the first flower bloomed, something changed. It wasn't just a garden anymore, it was memory. He placed a small wooden sign in the ground. Hand-carved. No branding. No logo. It simply read, "The Goodbye Garden," for the words we never got to say. News began to spread. Not because Keanu made an announcement, but because people who visited couldn't stop talking about it. Photos appeared online. People hugging each other. People crying. People kneeling by the flowers, whispering names, holding old photos, lighting small candles. Some left letters. Others left flowers. One man placed a tiny teddy bear and a note that read, "For my son, Liam. I'm sorry, I never showed up." Another woman left a crumpled paper with just 4 words. "I forgive you, Dad." Keanu visited the garden every morning when he was in town. Not to speak, just to sit. Sometimes he brought coffee. Sometimes he brought new seeds. He kept Hannah's letter in his coat pocket, and Miriam's note in his wallet. But the moment that changed everything happened one quiet afternoon. He was watering the roses when an older woman approached. She moved slowly, a cane in one hand, a folded paper in the other. She looked at Keanu with kind, tired eyes. "Is this your garden?" she asked. He shook his head gently. "It's everyone's." She smiled, then sat down on the bench nearby. "My name's Evelyn," she said. "I lost my husband 30 years ago. I was angry for so long I thought he left too soon. I never said goodbye." Keanu sat beside her. "But this," she said, gesturing to the flowers, "this place makes me feel like maybe it's not too late." She handed him the paper. "Can you read it for me? My hands shake too much these days." He unfolded it slowly. "Dear Ben, I was hurt. I didn't understand. But now I know you tried. You loved me the best way you could. And I'm sorry I didn't say it when I had the chance. I forgive you, I miss you, I love you. Evelyn Keanu read it with tears in his eyes. She smiled. I feel lighter already. The movement grew. People started building goodbye gardens in other cities. Some were big. Some just a patch of flowers in a backyard. Someone created a website where people could write letters anonymously and place them virtually into the gardens. It became a place of healing, of release. And all of it began with one man, one story, one regret. Clara, the reporter, found her own healing too. One night, she went live on her channel and shared the story of her brother Marcus. She read the letter she never sent. By the end, hundreds of thousands were watching. The comments section overflowed with people sharing their own stories. And for the first time in years, Clara felt like she wasn't just a journalist. She was a bridge between pain and healing. But one message would soon change everything. Keanu was sitting on the floor of his living room, sorting through handwritten letters from strangers. Some were heartbreaking, others full of hope. But one envelope caught his eye. It had no return address, no name. He opened it slowly. Inside was a photo of a young boy, and on the back, in neat handwriting, it said, "You saved me before you ever knew me. This is my goodbye, and my beginning." There was no signature, just that. Keanu stared at the picture for a long time. Something inside him stirred. He knew somehow that the movement was much bigger now. It wasn't about his story anymore. It was about everyone's. And yet, even with all the letters, gardens, and messages, something inside him still wasn't fully healed. He had done so much for others. But he hadn't yet faced one final truth. Something from deep in his past. Someone else he had never said goodbye to. Someone the world didn't even know about. Someone whose absence had shaped everything. And soon, he would have to go back to the beginning, to a secret he never planned to share, and a moment that would bring the story full circle. The secret he never told. Keanu stood in front of the mirror, the early morning light casting soft shadows across his face. He looked older than usual, not tired, but thoughtful. The kind of weight a person carries when something is unfinished, something buried deep. He reached into the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a box. Inside it were two things. The first was Miriam's letter. The second was a small bracelet. It was old, faded, made of blue thread and tiny beads. He held it in his hand for a long time. No one knew about this bracelet. No one knew about her. Not even his closest friends. Her name was Ella. Many years ago, before the fame, before the world knew his name, Keanu was in love. Ella wasn't a celebrity. She didn't want to be. She was a school teacher who worked with deaf children. She believed in quiet things, kindness, listening, holding space for others. They met in a bookstore. Keanu had been standing in the poetry section, trying to look like he understood what he was reading. Ella walked up beside him and picked up a book of haikus. Short poems, she had said, for people who feel things deeply but don't want to say too much. Keanu laughed. They talked for 2 hours in that bookstore, and they never really stopped talking after that. They were together for almost 3 years. Simple years. He wasn't famous yet. He was still working odd jobs, trying to make ends meet. Ella didn't mind. She'd leave notes in his pockets, cook soup when he got sick, listen to him practice lines late into the night. "Even if the world doesn't see you," she once said, "I do." She gave him the bracelet on his 24th birthday, said it was something her mother made when she was young, a symbol of promises. "What kind of promises?" Keanu had asked. Ella smiled. "The kind you keep even when it hurts." But life, as it often does, turned cruel. Ella got sick, a rare condition that came quickly and without mercy. Keanu stayed by her side, read to her, held her hand, whispered every line of poetry they ever loved. But near the end, she asked one thing of him. "Don't watch me fade." He begged her to let him stay. She smiled weakly. I want you to remember me as I was. Full of life. Full of light. He left the hospital that night, sat in his car for hours, unable to drive. When he finally returned the next day, she was gone. No goodbye. No final words. Just silence, and the bracelet on her pillow. He never told anyone about her, because the pain was too deep, because some wounds are too personal, and because saying it out loud would make it real. Until now. Keanu sat across from Clara again. They had agreed to do a follow-up interview, not for headlines, but to continue the conversation that had touched millions. The cameras were on. The lights were soft. The studio felt like a sacred space. Clara looked at him with gentle eyes. Since the last time, she said, people from all over the world have shared their regrets, their losses, their stories. But Keanu, do you have another one? Something you haven't shared yet? He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded and pulled out the bracelet. Clara didn't say a word. Keanu took a deep breath. Her name was Ella, he said. And slowly, carefully, he told the world about her. Every memory, every moment, every part of him that was shaped by her love and her loss. He spoke not as a movie star, but as a man who had once loved deeply and lost just as deeply. The audience didn't move. Many wept. Others closed their eyes, feeling their own stories rise to the surface. I never said goodbye to her, Keanu whispered. I couldn't. And for years I thought that made me weak. But now, I think it just made me human. He placed the bracelet on the table. This, he said, is my second biggest regret, but also my greatest lesson. Clara reached out and gently touched his hand. No more questions were needed. That moment said everything. After the interview aired, something unexpected happened. People began sending bracelets, handmade ones, store-bought ones, bracelets from childhood, bracelets worn by lost loved ones, bracelets that told stories of connection, heartbreak, and healing. Keanu created a new space inside every goodbye garden. He called it the Circle of Threads, a place where people could hang their bracelets. Each one told a story. Each one held a name. Each one whispered a goodbye. One morning, as he walked through the original garden near Miriam's old house, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. On the bench where Evelyn once sat was a new bracelet, blue thread, tiny beads, and a note. Dear Ella, I finally said it. Goodbye. Thank you for teaching me how to love. Keanu picked up the bracelet gently. He didn't know who left it, but he smiled, because he wasn't alone anymore. His pain had become a bridge, and others were crossing it. But just when it felt like peace had arrived, a letter showed up at his door. No return address, handwritten inside, only 5 words. You forgot one more goodbye. And underneath, an old photo of Keanu, age 5, holding the hand of a man whose face he hadn't seen in decades. His father, the man who left. And the final chapter Keanu thought he had buried forever was about to begin. The father-shaped silence, Keanu stared at the photo for a long time. His hands didn't move, his chest barely rose. It was as if the world had frozen, leaving only that one small image to speak the words no one had said in decades. It was him, 5 years old, laughing, his hand wrapped tightly around the rough, calloused fingers of a man with deep eyes and a crooked smile. His father, the man who vanished one day and never came back. Keanu had trained himself to forget, or maybe just to bury the memories. He told interviewers that his childhood was complicated. He smiled through questions about his past, and when someone mentioned family, he nodded politely and changed the subject. But this photo, this 5-word letter, you forgot one more goodbye. It had torn open a door he'd kept locked his entire life. He held the letter close to his chest and stood by the window. Outside, the sun was rising. Birds moved in patterns, chasing the light. But inside, Keanu felt cold. So many people had poured their pain into his goodbye gardens. Strangers had bled their hearts onto paper, trusted him with their deepest losses. And yet, here he was, hiding his own. He sat down, opened a journal, and began to write. Dear Dad, I don't know where you are. I don't know if you're alive, but I remember things. Little things. How you used to hum when you made toast. How you tossed me into the air and caught me like it was nothing. How you called me champ. And then you were gone. No note, no goodbye. I told myself you didn't matter, that I didn't need you. But the truth is, a boy always remembers who held his hand the first time he crossed the street. Maybe you were broken. Maybe you were scared. Maybe you didn't know how to be a father. I don't know, and I probably never will. But I need to say this. I forgive you, not because you asked, but because carrying the silence is heavier than carrying the truth. Goodbye, Dad. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Just writing the words felt like something had shifted. Keanu took the letter and walked to the original goodbye garden. It was early. No one was there yet. The morning dew kissed the flower petals. A gentle wind passed through the trees like a whisper. He kneeled in front of the circle of threads. Carefully, he tied the letter to one of the low-hanging branches of the memory tree. Then he added a small blank bracelet beside it, not to represent a loss, but a release. Hours later, Hannah arrived. She found Keanu sitting on the bench with his eyes closed. He looked peaceful. You okay? She asked. He opened his eyes slowly and smiled. Yeah. I think I just let go of something I've been carrying since I was 5. Hannah sat beside him. They didn't talk much that day. They didn't need to. Some silences are sacred. The next few weeks were full of changes. Keanu started receiving invitations, letters from schools, requests from community centers. People wanted him to speak. Not as an actor, not as a celebrity, but as a human being who knew how to say goodbye. One school in particular stood out. It was a small learning center for children who had lost parents to illness, addiction, or abandonment. They wrote, "Our kids don't need another speech. They need someone who understands what it's like to grow up missing someone." Keanu said yes. The auditorium was small. No flashing lights, no red carpets, just rows of tiny chairs and a sea of nervous, curious children. Some sat with folded arms. Others fidgeted. One little girl clutched a stuffed bunny that looked like it had been hugged 1,000 times. Keanu stood on stage. Not towering, not larger than life, just present. He didn't start with a story. He started with a question. Who here has someone they never got to say goodbye to? Almost every hand went up. He nodded, his voice gentle. Me too. He told them about Miriam, about Ella, and finally, about his dad. Not the way adults tell stories to children, but the way people tell truth to people. A boy in the second row raised his hand. How do you stop missing them? Keanu thought for a moment. I don't think you ever stop missing them, he said. But over time, you start remembering the love more than the loss. A girl whispered something to her friend. Then she raised her hand too. Can I write a goodbye letter? Keanu smiled. Of course. And so it began. They brought out paper and crayons, and those children, those brave, broken-hearted children, poured their souls onto the page. After that day, Keanu started something new. The Little Letters Project. Children around the world were encouraged to write letters to the people they'd lost. No rules, no pressure, just pure feeling. Within weeks, thousands of letters arrived. Some were just drawings. Some were simple lines like, I miss you, Mom. Others were pages long. And with every letter, the weight of grief found somewhere soft to land. Back in the original goodbye garden, Keanu built a second tree. The tree of beginnings. This one wasn't for regrets. It was for courage. Letters from children were placed there. A reminder that healing starts early, that love never really leaves, and that saying goodbye doesn't mean forgetting. One evening, Clara joined him at the garden again. The sun was setting. The flowers glowed gold. Families walked quietly, reading, the notes tying bracelets, holding hands. You know, Clara said, you could have just said your regret and moved on. Let the world feel sad for 5 minutes and then forget. But you didn't. Keanu looked around. At the garden, the children's letters, the bracelets swaying in the wind. Because Miriam didn't just change my life, he said. She showed me how to help others change theirs. Clara smiled. So what's next? Keanu looked out at the horizon. His voice was calm. One last story, he said. And then I think I'll be ready to say goodbye too. He wasn't talking about Miriam or Ella or even his father. He was talking about himself, the part of him that lived in silence, the part that had always felt like a stranger in his own story, and the part that, for the first time, was ready to come home. Goodbye. Keanu Reeves stood alone in the garden. The sky was overcast. The wind was soft. The air felt like it was holding its breath. The flowers around him danced gently, as if swaying to a silent melody. The wooden signs that marked the goodbye garden, and the circle of threads had aged a little now. The letters tied to the memory tree were countless, some faded, some new. But today he wasn't there to read letters. He wasn't there to receive praise. He wasn't there for anyone else. He was there to say goodbye to the version of himself he had carried for far too long, the version full of regret, silence, and pain that never had a place to land. He sat on the same bench where Evelyn had once handed him her note. He pulled out his journal. This time, there was no one watching. This was not for the world. This was for him. He turned to a blank page and wrote, "Dear me, you've been quiet long enough. You've listened to everyone else's pain, held their letters, stood strong for strangers, and tried to heal others when you were still bleeding inside. You've done good. Not perfect, not without mistakes, but good. You loved Miriam, and you never forgot her. You loved Ella, and you kept her bracelet all these years. You forgave your father, even when he never said sorry. And now it's time. It's time to stop carrying what's no longer yours to carry. It's time to stop being the boy who was left, and start being the man who chose to stay. You did your best, and that is enough. Goodbye, Keanu. Hello, peace." He closed the journal, and for the first time in his life, he felt light. Later that week, he made one final post online. It was a picture of the garden at sunset. No caption, no speech, just the image of a place that had become home for so many. Below it in the comments, thousands of people began sharing their goodbyes. Goodbye, anger. Goodbye, shame. Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, version of me that never felt enough. Keanu didn't reply to any of them. He didn't have to. The world was finally speaking for itself. Months passed. Keanu stepped away from public appearances. He spent his time planting, writing, listening. Sometimes he'd get a letter in the mail with no name, no return address, just a bracelet inside, or a drawing, or a line that simply said, "Thank you." He kept them all, but he didn't carry their weight anymore. He had learned to let go, not in a way that meant forgetting, but in a way that made room for living. One afternoon, Clara visited him again. She brought coffee. They sat on the porch of his quiet home, overlooking a simple patch of wildflowers he'd planted himself. "So," Clara asked, "do you still believe in regrets?" Keanu took a sip of his coffee and smiled. "I believe in learning," he said. "Regret is like fire. It can burn you, or it can light your way." She looked at him for a long time, then reached into her bag and handed him something small. It was a tiny plant in a glass jar, a new kind of flower. "For your next garden," she said. Keanu smiled and nodded. "Thank you." The final garden came quietly. No ceremony, no media, just Keanu, his shovel, the tiny plant, and a single wooden sign. It read, "This is not the end, just a soft place to begin again." He placed it in the earth gently, patted the soil, and whispered something under his breath, a goodbye, but also a promise. A few years later, people would still visit the gardens. They would find peace. They would cry. They would forgive. Some of them never knew the full story. Some only heard, "A rumor, wasn't this started by that actor?" But most didn't need to know, because the message had outgrown the man, and that was exactly what Keanu had hoped for. He didn't want to be remembered for the roles he played. He wanted to be remembered for the lives he helped change. And he was. Not as a star, not even as a hero, but as a man who knew the power of a goodbye and the miracle of what follows after.